Why do people in authoritarian states support dictatorship? While dictators are not chosen through the will of the people, no government can survive based on repression and the use of force alone. Even the most repressive dictatorship has its supporters in the general public. The first video for today discusses the concept of legitimacy, why people accept leaders. This video talks about how we can figure out how much popular support an authoritarian leader has. There are three elements to it. I first discuss how opinion polling works, then the challenges of taking opinion polls in authoritarian states, and I conclude with why these polls are actually often more accurate than we think. First, I want to talk briefly about how opinion polling works in general. Let me note that I am talking about polling in Eurasia and developing countries here, not the United States. I will touch briefly on US opinion polls later as a point of comparison, but the process I'm about to describe no longer works in the US. Opinion polling is based on statistical sampling, choosing a small segment of the population to represent the overall population. The best way to sample your population is to do it randomly. If you get a simple random sample of your overall population, you can be pretty sure that all of the characteristics of the population are distributed in the same way in your sample. The most common way to get a random sample is to get a list of everyone in the population and contact a randomly chosen segment of them. This list could be the census, that's often used for face-to-face polling. It could also be a phone directory, but the accuracy of the poll is based in part on truly getting a random sample, having an accurate list, randomly selecting a big enough group from it, and then actually getting that group to answer your questions. Polling in the United States has become less reliable because the methods I just described no longer produce a random sample in the US. It works for the census and other face-to-face methods, but phone directories are no longer accurate reflections of the population, and response rates are incredibly low. The threats to polling validity in authoritarian states are different. Response rates, particularly to phone surveys, are not the problem. So in authoritarian states, there are two categories of problems that essentially come down to how you ask questions and whether you believe the answers. First, on questions. As Henry Hale points out in The Myth of Mass Russian Support for Autocracy, translation is a big challenge for Americans asking questions about politics in other countries. Sometimes the problem is the actual translation of a word, but more often it is how a concept transfers from one country to another. Democracy is a huge concept that means many things to many different people. In particular, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, it was strongly associated with capitalism and economic prosperity in the minds of many citizens of the former Soviet Union. So asking about support for democracy, or rule of law, or dictatorship, or whatever, will mean many different things to many different people. Unless you're smart about how you ask the questions, you may not be measuring democratic values at all. Second, on answers. Here, the idea is that it is irrational for respondents to give an honest opinion about a dictator on a poll, since they don't really know who is asking. I'll explain why this is less of a problem than you would imagine in a moment, but first I wanted to talk about some ways to tell whether or not you're getting an honest answer to a question. The two main ways we have to evaluate the accuracy of answers to polling questions are essentially looking at response rates and asking special types of questions. While response rates to polls in Eurasia are generally pretty high, or at least high enough to generate random samples, respondents may still decline to answer individual questions. One way analysts evaluate sensitive questions is by looking at the number of I don't know or no response answers to questions. If the no response rate is much higher for a question about support for a leader than for an economic question, for example, that might indicate weak support for the leader. There are also a variety of ways to use experimental methods to try and get more accurate answers. These methods usually involve asking indirect questions about support for a leader. By asking a random half of your respondents one version of the question, and the other half a different version, you can compare the responses to the two versions and see if the difference matters. Let me give you an example to explain. A group of scholars trying to gauge popular support for NATO forces versus the Taliban in Afghanistan asked the following questions of different, random thirds of their sample. The baseline question was asking whether participants supported a proposal on prison reform, and just stated what the proposal is. The experimental questions, or treatments, said that either the Taliban or NATO was supporting this reform. Taking advantage of the fact that people tend to support policies advocated for by people they support, the scholars measured the difference between yes responses to the neutral question, the Taliban question, and the NATO question to measure support for the Taliban and NATO. This is called an endorsement experiment. This is generally thought to be a really good way to get a more accurate picture of opinion on sensitive topics, but it's actually very rarely done in Eurasia. One reason is that it's very complicated, and training and deploying people to do all this costs money that isn't always available for polling. But the other reason is that polling in Eurasia is often more accurate than you think. It's very counterintuitive, but on many questions, dictators actually have an incentive to allow accurate polling to take place. The idea is that dictators need information about what is going on in their country in order to maintain power. They can't get accurate information about areas of dissent or support from elections, since they're rigged, and information provided by elites is kind of suspect. There are lots of incentives to lie and present only good information to leaders in dictatorships. But it's a truism that dictatorships tend to fail when they start believing their own propaganda. Dictators need to know when pockets of dissent are arising and where they're coming from, so that they can direct security services there. They actually need accurate information in order to manage the balance of repression and co-optation effectively, and they can get that information from accurate polls. So when you look at pre-election polling in authoritarian regimes, it often accurately predicts the winners of elections. Now, you could say that the reason is because both the polls and the elections are rigged, but honestly, that is a lot of energy to expend on something that's just not that necessary. Since elections in competitive authoritarian states are rigged in advance, by arresting opposition leaders, promoting support for the leader in the media, and so on, polls can actually tell leaders whether these tactics are working or not. Super sensitive questions might still be off limits. For example, in Iran, you would never see an opinion poll asking about the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic, but not all political questions are subject to these red lines. For example, there is no danger in asking a question about support for Vladimir Putin because he is genuinely popular. Learning about variation in that popularity can only be useful for the regime. I wanted to end with one big caveat. While public opinion in authoritarian regimes is important, public support for authoritarian leaders is rarely the decisive element in sustaining a regime. While some authoritarian leaders, like Vladimir Putin, are genuinely popular, other regimes are able to maintain power with much less popular support. Again, to use Iran as an example, support for the regime is quite low, and large popular protest movements have emerged repeatedly over the past 10 years. At the end of the day, though, while no dictatorship can survive with no popular support, its ability to repress protests and dissent is what keeps it in power.